Our first panel discussion will ask, what's next for Manchester's office market? I'm pleased to welcome to the stage our speakers, Rory O'Connor, Director at Rock Consulting, Alex Russell, Managing Director of Property Alliance Group, Chris Cheap, Principal and Managing Director of Avison Young in Manchester, Liz Donnelly, Legal Director in Real Estate at DAC Beechcroft. Please could our speakers turn on your cameras and microphones if you haven't already? Thanks, everyone. So I'll kick off actually with you, Chris, if that's okay. I wonder if you could share some of your key observations of Manchester's office sector. For example, how have performance metrics such as lease length, space requirement, prices, and supply and demand dynamics changed since the start of the year?
Yeah, I'll kick off with some specifics and then put some comment around that. I think in terms of context in the market, we've probably got to go back to those heady, carefree days of January to think about where we are now, where whatever you thought of the results, the confidence that came from an election result in December did give confidence around the market, and we returned, certainly in central Manchester, office take-up figures of 320,000 square feet, which was in line with the 5-year quarterly average of circa 350,000 square feet. There was upward pressure on rents. We were in the process of probably moving towards a new record headline rent to Manchester of £40 a square foot that was certainly going to be achieved in the city in 2020. We were in good shape, and we were in the consistent shape that Manchester has been in for the last 10 years in terms of economic performance around real estate and offices. COVID hit. Clearly, none of those raw materials that make up the central Manchester office market went away, but people physically couldn't get into office space. People were not working from offices, and transactions pretty much dropped off a cliff. The second quarter of the year returned stats of roughly 75,000 square feet in terms of office take-up, which, believe it or not, is actually still quite robust. It's probably double Birmingham and probably treble Leeds in terms of that period of time. So the capacity was taken out of the market very quickly for a number of obvious reasons around COVID, not least the fact that people physically couldn't get into space to view it. How that's coming through, Q3 figures are showing pretty similar to the Q2 figures, largely for the same reasons, although we have seen an uptick. There's been a consistent level of demand below 10,000 square feet throughout the entire period, and I think that is down to just businesses being more nimble in that size bracket and probably having shorter lines of communication and perhaps less bureaucracy about them getting back to the workplace, etc. There's a couple of larger transactions in the market, and there's pockets of activity around larger transactions in the market that are in train that will bolster take up this year. But essentially, the market has hit pause largely, and like I say, that there's been activity. Our agents are out viewing buildings, certainly at the smaller level across the city. Rents, we haven't had rents tested yet because of the lack of true transactions, so we haven't seen downward pressure. We haven't seen the potential for grey space entering the market, which is space where occupiers are looking to offload their own space that they don't need anymore, and that will undoubtedly create some downward pressure on rents. So it's not a great picture, but like I said at the outset, the raw materials are still there, and that's a very strong labour pool, and that's a very strong delivery pipeline of office stock. There's 1.5 million square feet of space under construction in central Manchester, and nearly 50% of that is pre-committed. So there's a strong pipeline of office stock coming through of really well-designed space, and we can talk about design a little bit later because it's really very relevant. I will let others speak in a moment, but return to office is a very strong theme in the market. There is no getting away from it. We have office occupiers with swathes of staff sat working remotely for a number of reasons, operational around not wanting to travel into offices, and in other cases, maybe economic reasons where they've asked people to take pay cuts and they don't want them to have to incur the costs of transporting into off city centres, etc. So there is a number of different reasons. I think the one thing, and we can expand on this point later, I think the one thing that we've all got to accept around office occupation going forward is that the Monday to Friday 9 to 5 has gone and it's dead. And thankfully so. There's lots of things that COVID will bring to an end, like presenteeism, like poorly designed office space, hopefully. And I think what the skill is now, because office occupiers have been catapulted to the end of a spectrum of agile working. And if presenteeism and 9 to 5 is here and where we are is there, it's now the skill of employers to bring their staff back somewhere on that spectrum that works for the employee, that works for the employer, and works to support revenues. And every single business will have a different point on that spectrum.
Absolutely. Okay, thanks. That's a really good overview. Just one further point to you. I mean, clearly in terms of the sort of opportunities then at the moment, other than the sort of practicalities of, getting workers back into the office, and everybody is taking their own approach to that. You mentioned about how the largest opportunities or the most activities seem to be in the smaller space requirement market. What about location hotspots across Manchester? Are people still very much looking at the sort of new areas coming out of the ground, or actually is it about spaces that have been, operational and functioning for many, many years?
I spoke about that 75,000 square feet central Manchester take-up for the first time in as long as I can remember. Out of town take-up outstripped central Manchester take-up in the second quarter of this year. And I think when we talk about near working, I think anecdotally, where the suburbs of Manchester are seeing activity around F&B and restaurants, and I know hospitality is dropping off, but we're seeing lots of activity where people can perhaps walk up, and that's no different to working. And I think the satellite towns of Manchester will see a greater level of desirability from office occupiers in terms of near working, perhaps. And listen, as we emerge from this, and I don't say a post-COVID world, because I don't know if we'll ever be in a post-COVID world, but as we live with COVID going forwards, the city centre, it will not be the end of the city centre. All of those attributes that are there in a city centre in terms of access to a ready, mobile, cost-effective, educated labour pool, public transport infrastructure, all the brand Manchester that we love so much and has been such a draw for office occupiers for as long as we can really remember in the market, is still going to be there. But there is also going to be an emerging market now where people want to work nearer to home. And I'm not advocating at all going back to the days of perhaps the late 80s and 90s, where people were throwing up pavilion-style brick-built office buildings around motorway junctions. I don't think that's the future, but I think proper, thought-through suburban office space around chimney pots in some of these suburban areas of Greater Manchester is going to perform, and it's going to have desirability because people have had a glimpse of a new way of working, and that's a strong backdrop for that new way that they found. Okay, great. I'd like to discuss that more a bit later on in our panel, actually. But Liz from DAC Beechcroft, I wonder what you're hearing from your clients in the market. How are occupiers using the office, and do they expect trends such as this blended flexible working to continue for the foreseeable future? Does a lot of what Chris has outlined chime with you?
Yeah, it does, absolutely. I think one of the words that first chimed was pause, where I think that's what we're finding with our clients, that corporate occupiers are taking stock of what their needs are, not making any rash decisions at the moment, and reviewing their options, asking for advice on what their options are in the immediate future, but not making long-term strategic decisions yet because we don't know how it's going to pan out. I think firms like our own are taking surveys of staff to find out what their concerns are about safety at the moment in the current crisis, and then looking also longer term at kind of learnings from lockdown and how people have found working from home, working remotely, what they'd like to see in the future, what we as a firm can do better, that sort of thing. So I think a degree of uncertainty at the moment, but I'm optimistic the COVID phase will pass and that we'll come to a new way of working, and it will be, we're not going back. I think Chris is right. A hybrid hybrid workers are here to stay.
Okay, thanks, Liz. Let's hear from our developer on the panel then now, Alex from Property Alliance Group. Can you tell us about some of the office projects you're working on in Manchester at the moment, and how have they been impacted by current trends and challenges? Have you had to redraw any plans perhaps since the pandemic took hold?
Yeah, I think as Chris said, it's largely too early to tell. We're very fortunate that we don't have much void in our portfolio at the moment, but the 2 or 3 schemes that we have in design stage at the moment, I think it just gives us increased confidence that we need to put the people first, that the demand will be there for higher quality offices, more naturally ventilated space, wide open spaces where people can collaborate and be motivated to come into the office. I think over the last 4 or 5 years, I've noticed on any viewing, a lot of the office requirements, as Crystal vouched for, is now being led by HR directors, and that's only going to increase over the near term and the longer term, because the people are the priority. I think we all know now that agile working has been a thing for 4 or 5 years. The reality is it's probably 30% of the workforce pre-COVID. Post-COVID, it's probably 50% of the workforce. So we need to be able to design our offices in a way that's going to motivate the employees to want to come into the office.
Yeah.
Ultimately, we need the collaboration, we need the interaction, and the biggest problem is training. At the moment in the COVID world, you've not been able to train staff, bring them on board, mentor them. I think a lot of the Generation Zers, they cherish that one-on-one time with the business leader more than anything else. So I think in terms of the biggest difference in design would be the flexi workspace. I think that will almost go. I think the biggest thing we'll see is that employees will demand ownership of their space. So I don't think you can share a desk in a post-COVID world. I think so. The net result on the space will be the same. You've got to create spaces where people can collaborate and work together and meet together, but they will want to come in the 2 or 3 days a week they are in. They will want their own desk. So I think the space, as I say, ultimately end up the same.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Alex. Just for those of our audience who aren't familiar with your project, can you give a very quick overview of what's the sort of key 1 or 2 schemes that are in your in tray at the moment?
Yeah, our next big scheme that's probably be launching at the start of next year will be Reedham House, which is on King Street West, which is down from San Carlo and Kendall's. It's forms a central part of the SRF that has just been signed off by Manchester City Council. So that'll be office space, and big thing there is we're going to be reusing the existing space. So we're a big part of what we want to push over the next decade or so is the carbon neutral agenda, net zero, along with other developers like Bruntwood and Peel and Urban Splash. It's obviously high on Manchester's agenda. So by reusing those buildings down there, I think we can create one of the things we're looking at, for example, is naturally ventilated space, open entrances, probably more than one entrance in a post-COVID world. That's one thing we changed. And we've already had 2 or 3 people who've obviously seen the sign up that we're going to do something. And all the inquiries have been around, what are you going to do for that, post-COVID world, the net zero world. So I think my biggest difference I've noticed is probably when we looked at this in February, March this year, pre-COVID, I was nervous that maybe we're 5 or 6 years ahead of the curve, and will people pay for this type of office space? I think the reality is COVID has just fast-tracked that requirement, so hopefully everyone gets on board with it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Alex. Just as a reminder to everybody, if there's sort of background noise, just feel free to sort of mute yourself and Alex, you're a tiny bit muffled, so if you could just make sit close to your screen, just so our audience can hear them. But yeah, we could definitely catch what you were saying. Rory from ROC, something we're sort of moving towards talking about is this fight for quality then that's expected in the coming months. So, office space is really going to have to deliver on a number of levels, more so than it ever has done. How do you think Manchester can best capture this quite disparate workforce that a lot of companies are kind of grappling with at the moment and meet this increasingly high expectation of what office space should provide?
Great question. Thank you for that. So I mean, in my mind, this is a multi-layered issue. It's one that previous speakers have said, we're not, I don't know if we're in the middle of it or not, but we don't quite know how this is going to pan out. But what is really clear from what we've learned so far is, and what's been said, I mean, only 50% of the workers across Europe are on average returning to work in their offices over 5 days a week. So people seem to be, on the one hand, much happier working from home part of the time, but there's also a real desire for people to come back into the workplace. So how do you deal with that going to question? And I think Alex has mentioned a couple of things there: multiple entrances to buildings, lifts, ventilation. So if you're going to get people back into offices, and I don't think that the office space will perhaps be as we've had it for obvious reasons. But for example, 22 Bishopsgate, they turned off the air conditioning, the recirculating, so hence the natural ventilation. So you're sort of starting to think, are tall buildings really the answer? So what impact does that have on land cost or land value and so on and so forth? It also sort of plays into the whole carbon agenda in terms of, low embodied carbon in buildings. That's been mentioned already. In terms of what the internal spaces look like and work like, I guess it's lack of contact with surfaces, more actuated or automated entries into buildings and so on and so forth. Less contact with surfaces, as I think Alex said, people will probably want to own the desk they sit at for the time that they are in the office. So it's a really complex issue. And the biggest, I think Liz mentioned surveys of staff, and the biggest issue in my mind about getting, I mean, the cities are clearly not dead. People want to get back here. The high streets are going to change dramatically. They have to change, and the writing's been on the wall with the advent of, online shopping, stuff like that for quite a few years. But really, it's how people get to their place of work. So we've had a situation of the past, 10 years where there's almost been positive legislation against the car in the city, yet most people still travel by car, surprisingly. And people are going to want to do that. So you can provide a nice, safe place for them to work in and hopefully the right kind of environment. But how do they get to that place of work? So that kind of pushes the argument, doesn't it, towards what Chris said about more opportunity being outside perhaps the city centre. So there's it's like 60-70% of people actually only commute within the borough. It's quite a big number. But I think it's going to take a wee bit of time to unravel. But I think also, the city leadership have got a big part to play. I think we maybe need to revisit the strategic frameworks and so on. And I'm imagining in my mind that what we have to do, part of what we have to do, is make Manchester a really beautiful place to be, to get people to come in. So there really is a lot to do. I'm sorry for going on, but it's quite a complex issue.
Absolutely.
Sarah, can I just come in there on just a couple of points? I think, listen, I'm a naturally positive person, those people who know me, but it is very clear that in the short term, the office market in multiple sectors is going to be challenged for the next 12 months. So we've got to be very clear in how we're defining this. When we talk about development, we're talking about a new phase of development. The city is actually coming to the end of a development cycle at the moment, and we're looking at a new. So we're talking about product we're designing now that we're delivering potentially into a different marketplace in a couple of years. So I think we define away from that there will be a reduction in space people take, and I say that in a world where we're living with COVID in the future, because of that need. Or having less people in the office all the time, that end of presenteeism that I spoke about. But you used the words flight to quality a couple of times, and I think quality will still prevail in a challenged marketplace. And when we have this grey space entering the market, which is tenants offloading their own space, which is actually quite difficult to do, subletting space, assigning space is messy and it's difficult and you have to get involved, and occupiers don't really want to be landlords and it's all a bit difficult. That's there will be a flight to quality, and therefore the emphasis needs to be on landlords at the moment in terms of refurbs, really focusing on going that extra mile to delivering what occupiers want. Is this you spoke about the death of the office at the outset and it not being the death of the office. I don't think it is the death of the office, but it's completely a seminal moment in how offices are going to be occupied going forwards. And we'll look on this as a key point in history around office occupation. Going forwards in terms of the development of buildings, I sat in a design team meeting on Tuesday with M&E consultant, cost consultant, architect, and we challenged them to say, we're delivering this building into a market in 3 years' time. Well, it needs to be 5 years ahead of its time in 3 years' time, and that's incredibly difficult, and that's a challenge to ask people to do. But the next round, the next development cycle of buildings in Manchester have got to embrace tech. They've got to embrace new filtration systems around airflows. It will be a mixed use, and everything Rory's just said, because Rory's far more informed on it than me. But the challenges there are very real, and there will be very real demand from occupiers. And the piece that's been missing up to now is people prepared to pay a premium for that better product. And I don't believe that up until now they have. If there's been two buildings that deliver essentially the same specification, but one is slightly enhanced in terms of sustainability, I think an occupier is not going to pay a premium for one or the other potentially. But now we're going to move into a world where people are going to pay a premium for buildings that deliver what they need in a post-COVID world and support the well-being factors they need for their staff. And Alex is absolutely right in what he said earlier. We used to be, every property decision used to be led by cost, and that was probably led out at the last recession. We saw it, people being central to every property decision over the last 5 to 6 years. We've seen a material shift into people, as I say, being people-centric decisions, and that will continue to be the case. And it's important we use previous recessions and economic downturns as a reference point for what we do. But we've got to rebuild this city, and we've got to do the next development cycle based on what occupiers need and what they're going to want. And they're going to want really good space that supports their ability to attract talent. And talent is just so important. I appreciate we're going to go through an employment blip, but I think it will be relatively short because the markets and businesses will get back to normal. And that battle for talent is very, very real. And the real estate decisions are based on attracting talent largely.
I wonder actually on the back of actually the insight in terms of looking at the next development cycle, Alex, do you want to tackle our first question from the audience of the day? We've got a question from Stuart Grant, which is, if you're designing the ideal brief, forget restraints, but for a new post-COVID city centre development, it says housing and office. I think it's housing.
Yeah.
But please, Stuart, if you want to clarify for your question, if we're not answering it properly, stick another note there. But what would be your top 3 priorities for it then, Alex?
I think I'd probably go back to my earlier point. Real big advocate for the net zero push and drive in Manchester. So I think if cost wasn't an issue, which it obviously is to do that, I would love to do a net zero building. I think if you look at the Generation Y, Generation Z, I think probably a Claremont report I read yesterday, 9 out of 10 employees would put as their number 1 priority the environment that they work in. So I think I would go back to the earlier point. One of my key things on design would be ownership of space and the building, how that reflects us as a developer, but then also our occupiers in the buildings. Second one would probably be function, in terms of how you access the building. As I said before, multiple accesses. Cost wasn't an issue. I think you could probably have 4 or 5 different entrances into a building now, but obviously we want to get close as possible to the gross to net. Final one, probably top 3 priorities. I think cost. I think if we can keep the cost down for the occupier, then that'd obviously be the dream result.
Yeah. Okay. While you're talking, Alex, there was a question from Philip Doyle. Great to hear you talking about naturally ventilated office space. We've been championing this for 10 years. What do Chris and Alex think about the existing stock that's fully AC? What do you think, Alex? Is that going to be a bit of a challenge, or are we going to kind of get beyond this? Is it going to be about a sort of mix of new build and existing stock? How complicated is it to retrofit that?
Very complicated to retrofit it. I think the reality is it has to be a drive for new developments, or at least extensively refurbished developments. The cost to do a retrofit would be monumental, to be fair. But certainly in any of our new developments, that's right at the top of our agenda. As I said before, all the occupiers that we're speaking to at the moment for moves in 2-3 years down the line, that's going to be an expectant thing. You have to provide it, I think, going forward.
Right. Okay.
It's interesting Phil raised that question, and it's something I was going to say, because Phil's very active in the BCO, and I think that the measures we use around office development, like BCO, have a really important part to play here. And I think there's a bit of catch up to be done around the BCO guide and specifications, because most conversations I'm having are now saying, well, we're going to go away from the BCO guide in some cases to deliver what occupiers are asking for. And I think there is a little gap between reference points we use like BCO and the direction of travel of the market, and that will catch up. It's probably just an inflection of time, but they are very, very important to how we're going to deliver product going forward.
Yeah, I think another thing to look out for as well is something that I've come across that's largely in America is the WELL certification. So we're obviously aware of BREEAM, and as Chris says, BCO. We've had wide score to score your connectivity. The WELL certification actually focuses on the space itself. So all the things that we're talking about, the natural ventilation, mental health for the staff, gym provision, etc. So I think that will really become at the forefront of occupiers' requirements probably next year and the year after, how highly the building scores in the WELL certification.
Yeah.
Part L building regulations are going to have it's 2010, the last round of Part L, but it's going to have to catch up here. There's going to have to be a new round of Part L coming through to deliver everything that Alex has just spoken about.
Yeah. Okay. Now, a lot of these, the technical, the sustainability, and some of these technological points, I want to sort of flesh out more. We're going to be also talking about them more in our next panel. I want to move on and talk about funding issues of investment at this time. Chris, actually, before we held this event, cautioned that the whole economy is in a holding pattern at the moment. We've yet to see the impact of the end of the furlough scheme at the end of this month, and the end of the health crisis, and how it will continue to affect commerce in general. Liz, I wonder what you think about what this means for the financing of office schemes. Do you think banks are going to be more reluctant to lend to developers? What are you hearing from your clients at the moment? Are they worried? What are the implications, therefore, for office investment?
I think we're in a similar position that we were in retail maybe 10 years ago, where the shift went from kind of long-term 10-year leases, 15-year leases with a break at 10 to much shorter. It's quite unusual now to see a retail lease longer than 5 years. And I think this is going to play out in the office market as well. It will be interesting to see what happens at the moment, or where there are transactions and landlords agreeing deals. They're on a very short-term basis, sort of people staying put for another 12 months just to see how things pan out, or short-term leases with a break. And I can't see occupiers committing to longer-term arrangements in the short term. I don't know what Chris is seeing or getting from demand, and that has an impact on valuation and the willingness of funders to fund.
Yeah. Okay. And what about actual current funding issues at the moment? Are office occupiers able to pay their rents at the moment? I mean,
well, there's a distinction between able and can or are. Willing, yes. So I think there has been, again, not on the same scale as we've seen in the retail market, where retailers have genuinely struggled to pay rents because they've got no income. That businesses who have got a workforce working from home are still generating income and profit and making money. And we have seen some, I'd like to sort of say, trying it on, because landlords are prohibited at the moment from taking action against tenants, can't forfeit and can't issue statutory demands, which leaves them with kind of very little remedy in terms of pursuing tenants who can pay but won't, so just kind of holding on to their cash.
Right. Okay.
So I don't know if Alex has got.
What's the landlord-tenant relationship at the moment, Alex?
Yeah, I think Liz is absolutely right. It's just trying to figure out who is being honest and genuinely can't pay and who's trying it on. I think we're fortunate that we've not got too much retail. The vast majority of our office tenants have got various challenges ahead of them and have had over the last 6 months. The way we handled it is we divvied up the tenancy list, and we did red, amber and green. We actually spoke to every single tenant one by one, prioritised the reds, then the ambers, just hear from them straight from the horse's mouth how they see the future challenges. And then we've just responded each one individually. Some people are paying monthly, some people have remained paying quarterly, other people absolutely can't pay at the moment, so we've worked out a payment plan for the next 12, 18 months. So I think the biggest thing there is we've had quite a lot of feedback of tenants saying they've paid us whereas they've not paid other landlords, and that is fundamentally because we've bothered to pick up the phone and speak to them. So for me, it really just enhances the need for a closer relationship with the developer and the customers.
Okay, thanks, Alex.
Can I just pick up on that lease flexibility point as well because I think that is absolutely key to the investment market going forwards. There was a gravitation towards lease flexibility anyway. COVID has accelerated that. I think the average lease length in the UK last year began with a 4 and had significant downward pressure on it. I think we still will see some longer lease terms committed to. There are several reasons why occupiers commit to longer leases. If they've right-sized their occupational footprint, they know how much space they need, they're in a secure industry that doesn't fluctuate too much, then I think they will still sign longer leases on the basis that that's how they achieve the bigger incentive packages from landlords, and they want to amortize the cost of their fit out over a longer period to right across their balance sheets. So there are still drivers for businesses to sign longer leases if they're in a position to do so in a stable market. But it's absolutely right. We will see a greater level of flexibility around office occupation, and there's got to be a re-education on all sides, not least valuers perhaps, and that's got to be driven by the RICS, because the institutional investment market is going to have to reset in terms of, and it's a pricing thing, and it will reset via pricing. They're going to have to value shorter term income, and it's going to have to stand up. And that's going to be a really important factor going forwards, that re-education that occupiers, there's a trade-off for flexibility from occupiers. You don't get those big incentive packages because a landlord has to value his term certain income. And investors have to realize that there's going to be a pricing differential based on, or vendors, should I say, a pricing differential based on that flexibility on their tenancy schedule.
I think what helps actually with that price differentiation as well, and to allow this flexibility on lease length, we're already seeing a few of our tenants who've got lease events coming up next year who are asking for shorter leases, but in return they're actually offering to pay a higher rent for that actual agreed extra flexibility. So that also helps in our conversations with the funders. We're looking at 2 or 3 opportunities now for the next year. And in terms of actually valuing that, I don't think the rents are going down. I think they're going up. If people want increased flexibility, they want more fitted out space ready to use, but they will pay a premium for it. And yes, it will be shorter leases. And as Chris says, the funders have got to get their heads around that.
But it's never more valid, and we touched upon it with people paying their rents at the moment. But that landlord-tenant relationship has never been more important. And it is those buildings where the relationship is strong, where you can offer people flexibility, but you feel comfortable that you've got the relationship, you've provided the right space, that they will stay at lease renewal time. And they'll stay because of that relationship. And investors will gravitate towards product that's managed well, that's been thought through in terms of refurbishment, where that asset management relationship is strong. And we are, there's a quiet revolution in property management services across advisors such as ourselves at the moment. We're in an expect more arena from tenants. It's not a case of just collecting rent and providing services and making sure the toilets function and all of those things. We're in an expect more arena, and advisors, landlords, developers have all got to react to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, okay, so yeah, I mean, Rory, I was going to ask you actually. Yeah. Unfortunately, some offices will end up empty. I'd love to hear your view on what everybody has said, but I wonder, do you see opportunities for alternative uses for unoccupied offices, and how straightforward would that be?
I think people are doing it already, converting offices into residential accommodation, and I think a fairly easy win. That's been done already. In terms of high streets, you could see large stores, maybe department stores and the like, being utilised perhaps as sort of micro distribution spots or pickup spots, or activity and imagination on that front. It's got to happen. But I think there's a danger here as well. We talked about design earlier, and that the working assumption might be that this will learn to live with the COVID-19 by 2022, 2023. There will be hopefully a vaccine and other things like that. But this is probably not the last time this sort of situation is going to occur. And the danger would be, I think, in focusing on the here and now rather than a sort of medium to long-term strategy for how we anticipate the future. And as I think Chris said earlier, working out how something is going to look in 3 to 5 years' time is a real challenge. But the key word is going to be flexibility of space.
Liz, from a legal point of view, how do we build in this sort of flexibility for office developers and occupiers in the future? This future-proofing. I mean, we've already seen the introduction of so-called COVID clauses in construction contracts, for example. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think there's a general willingness to accept the kind of COVID drafting in the short-term arrangement that is the development agreement, so that people are willing to allow extensions of time for delays, both kind of developer and occupier. So construction of the development and the tenant fit out. What hasn't kind of materialised yet is a fixed position on the long-term arrangements, and landlords unwilling to concede rent suspensions, for example, if this happens again in the future. That kind of discussion is still ongoing.
Yeah, okay. We've had a question actually from the audience, John Hartles. Protection of design specifications would aid some things mentioned. Do you think more traditional type contracts might increase to secure ambitions of quality space and use of real innovation? What do you think about that, Liz? Does it, from a sort of legal point of view?
Yeah.
I'm glad you got that one, Liz.
John, if you're out there in the audience, perhaps you might need to clarify exactly your question. But I think it certainly, as Liz says, some of this future-proofing, including design specifications, perhaps will need to be brought into contracts, and some of this flexibility actually sort of permitted, really.
Yes. Yeah.
I think the issue with, if I understand the question correctly, with a traditional contract, will be management of cost. Really, it allows the client, I think, to be very prescriptive about what they're going to get, which I think that's where the question's coming from, which is what we're all talking about. But it goes to what Chris was saying earlier. That will push the build cost without a doubt. I just wonder if, in some ways, this is a real wake-up call, and we become a wee bit complacent about the product we're generating. And this is a wake-up call for everybody to actually re-engineer and reimagine the space that we're going to provide people with. It's a tough call for people who are designing now.
I think there's a point there about well as well, which is really really relevant at the moment, because clearly well encompasses a lot of the things we're talking about in design, but it's ridiculously expensive. And the viability of delivering well into buildings is something that will be discussed in design team meetings across the city and across the country at the moment. I think we're looking at using well as much as we can and creating well-enabled designs, but perhaps allowing the occupier to deliver their own well agenda when they come and occupy the space, and use that backdrop of a well-enabled design. And that's certainly the approach that we're seeing more and more across. The other point I'd make is there's a question about co-working. Co-working is a very buzzword across Manchester over the last few years. WeWork strode into Manchester, Spaces strode into Manchester with their first centres outside of London. It was an important factor supporting take-up over the last couple of years. You've got to define co-working very carefully, because the actual term to use is flexible workspace. Co-working is something very different, where people sit together in a shared environment that clearly doesn't necessarily work in a COVID world where we're distancing from each other. Flexible workspace is very different, and I think the market, the co-working flexible workspace market, is pivoting away from co-working being front and central to it, to more flexible workspace. And we see large amounts of corporate occupiers drawing their space as a service from third-party occupiers on a flexible basis, and paying a premium maybe for a 12, 18-month, 2-year contract for office space from a third party. So the flexible workspace sector is going to pivot far more to what they call an enterprise solutions model, rather than that co-working model that grabs all the headlines of people in skinny jeans and gazelle trainers sat around beer pubs. Yeah. It's that flexible workspace. It's that space as a service agenda, which is going to be really important as we move through this event that's creating all this turbulence in property and real estate.
Yeah, absolutely. Alex, I wonder, what are your thoughts on co-working not flexible working, because it is, as Chris says, it is a different thing. Do you think co-working that's a worrying sector at the moment? There's not many opportunities for growth in that particular type of office space at the moment.
Yeah, I think Chris has hit the nail on the head. It's not co-working, it's a flexible space, and I think the main thing coming forward is making it purposeful, giving that place a meaning. As I said, the employee wants to come in and know where it can actually do the work. I think one of the biggest negatives I read recently was actually noise in getting your actual productivity up. 40% of people said noise was a disruption to get the work done. I think in co-working, I know 2 or 3 people who worked in a WeWork said that you can't have a serious meeting because there's a dinosaur running past you, or somebody's hit a table tennis ball into the middle of your meeting room. So I think that there's no growth in co-working in the way I see it, because there's already so much of it in Manchester already. God knows what's going to happen to all of that WeWork space and the spaces, but I'd imagine it'd be reimagined. In terms of co-working, obviously the shared kitchens, shared meeting rooms, shared facilities, I think that changes. We're looking at 2 or 3 of our buildings which previously would have been co-working, and we've just redesigned them because get companies back to work, and to do that they want to have their own kitchen again now. They want to have their own meeting room. So as Chris says, it's more flexi rather than co-working.
Yeah, okay. Alex, actually, while you're talking, there is one more question I had for you, and that's about this location question. I think it was Chris earlier who mentioned this potential new role for the suburban offices, whether as a sort of a whole relocation for city centre firms, or even sort of touchdown satellite offices to support their other workspace. And this could, of course, help in the wider regeneration of other parts of Greater Manchester. Do you see opportunities there for PAG?
Yeah, definitely. Anyone that knows our work, we've done very well out of town offices and business parks, and again, really focusing on the actual people who are going to be occupying them. So I think it did seem to come back into the city centre the last 2 or 3 years, but absolutely, probably 4 out of the last 5 viewings I've done have been out of town offices now, whether that be back on the traditional business parks like Birchwood or around Manchester Airport. But also, I think back to the town centre as well, back to the high street. Places like Altrincham, Wilmslow, Stockport, Bury, Oldham. I think you will see an increase in take-up. As Chris said, I think before you already said it was the high take-up for a while out of town. I think, you know, the big banks, I think it was Barclays said that they won't have 3,000 staff in a big office going forward. I think they'll go full circle back to having a city centre base, but then also satellite office in the key Manchester town centres.
Okay.
I think you know, Alex doesn't need me to compliment him, but I think Property Alliance Group were ahead of the game in this. Their work around Towers Business Park was they repositioned that asset so that it had a level of amenity that supported people. The amount of chimney pots around Towers Business Park is amazing, and the walk up and the ability of people to work close to their home, but working in an environment that has some green space with it, that has some amenity, some really amenity that you might find in a city centre as well. That quality of coffee shop and that quality of coffee and environment. Property Alliance Group were ahead of the game in that, in what they delivered at somewhere like Towers, and now we've got to think about how do we go again with that suburban office environment.
Yeah. I think it's access to work as well. It's access to the office. By doing that business park or the town centre, you can get to work a lot easier. Obviously, transport is still the biggest deterrent for people getting into the city centre. So until that improves, I think there will be increased demand for out-of-town offices.
Okay, and with that, you know, new commuter flows going in other directions, perhaps all of that will have to be accommodated as well, won't it? We're reaching the end of our panel session, I'm afraid, everyone. I thought I'd just bring up, John Hartles has actually clarified his question. Sometimes quality gets confused, being polite brackets in the tender process, hence why I asked about the importance of protecting design specifications and contracts. So I think hopefully, John, we answered your question there about protecting design within more flexible clauses in contracts. So there's absolutely way more that we could discuss. We've got one question just before we wrap up about telecoms, and hopefully we'll explore this more in the second panel. But I wonder if Rory, perhaps you want to just tackle that one for Dave Ferry. How can telecoms support the changing environment? I think it's a good one to wrap up on. Okay,
well, so interestingly, obviously, with people working remotely, but people working in the city, having good bandwidth is absolutely vital. And it's amazing, when I looked it up the other day, Manchester is not on the list of the top 10 cities with the biggest bandwidth, fastest broadband speeds over 100 megabytes per second. And that is just absolutely fundamental. Why we don't have that, I have no idea. But sorry, if the questioner can actually deliver that, we'd all be very happy, I think.
I think connectivity in terms of fibre diversity and the delivery of fibre into buildings, when you, at the coalface, when you go and speak to occupiers and do viewings, it's probably, if it's not, it's their second or third question they will ask you when you get to a building: what is your fibre connectivity? That's gone up a level recently in terms of specification with products like Node, which are really important, having nodes in building, because that helps you navigate around the need for way leaves and such like within the building. It can help you with the number of service providers you can have into a building. So going forward, I would hope, wired score is an important thing for assessing the connectivity of a building. I would hope we don't need it, because I think there's just an assumption that every building will be brilliantly connected with fibre diversity, some kind of node technology that helps a building be as connected as it possibly can be. Because frankly, if we haven't learned anything from the last six months, quality internet is going to be like another utility going forwards, isn't it? That we consider alongside gas and water and all of those other things. And Rory's absolutely right. Upping our game on a regional level in terms of the quality of that provision is going to be critical to economic performance. I can't overplay the importance of it. Yeah, and this question might hitch off. Right. Will we see similar challenges for businesses finding a balance between homeworking in the office, online? Yeah, I think that all plays into that, doesn't it? About how important technology and connectivity is.
I think that's the biggest point there. If we are going to be working from home 2 or 3 days a week, which I suspect, then everybody's internet at home needs to have a drastic improvement. I think we've all been on those awkward calls where people are cutting in and out. So that will become an increasing priority of businesses to actually make sure that employees have sufficient telecoms at home as well.
Sure. Okay, great. Well, I think that's all we've got time for, I'm afraid, folks. But a big virtual round of applause to our speakers then for a really brilliant, insightful conversation. So much stuff going on there, and hopefully we can sort of drill down deeper into some of these points in our next panel. Also to our attendees for your questions and input, thank you very much. Hopefully we thrashed out some of the answers to these huge questions that are in everyone's heads at the moment. Could I ask you please to stay on for the networking break, and we'll be back for the second half presentation and panel in 20 minutes. Let's now switch to networking mode. Thank you very much, everyone, and see you shortly.
Hi there, I'm Murray Levinson from Squire and Partners, and I'm going to just share my screen, turn off my camera, and talk to you a little bit about a project that we have recently completed in Manchester called the Landmark Manchester. Okay, great. So yes, Landmark Manchester, an office scheme completed the early part of this year. You can see a picture of it here. On the right hand side, deliberately showing it in context with a building which sits on the square itself, number 1, St. Peter's Square. And the reason I show that is that we were really the final piece in the City Council's vision for the redevelopment of St. Peter's Square and the Civic Quarter. We were actually involved quite some time ago, back in 2004, thinking about how this entire area could be regenerated and redeveloped. Not only our site, which was the location of an Odeon cinema, Elizabeth House, which was just next to us, and also the kind of potential for transforming St. Peter's Square, improving it as a sense of place, along with the introduction of a new transport hub and network and the tram system that was coming. We recognize that there was the opportunity for increasing scale for any future development, not only on our site, but also on the Elizabeth House site, particularly as you recognize traveling in towards the city centre, where naturally scale does increase. We were particularly interested in the relationship of the top of our building. As you travel north along the Oxford Road, there are a number of these kind of really special Belvedere towers on the historic buildings, grand historic buildings along that route in towards the city centre, and we wanted to be part of that story and part of that language. The plan recognised very early on that the adjoining site to us here on the central diagram on the left-hand side of our plot, Elizabeth House, was being redeveloped, and that really led us to the conclusion, the sensible conclusion as to where the core would be located. The benefit of that was that we had this opportunity to create amazing, fantastic views of the city facing south, maximising therefore the amount of daylight into the office space, and creating wonderful open plan space that was ultimately really flexible in terms of the numbers of tenancies that one could provide on the floor. That elevation that faced south, and indeed our approach to the elevational design, really took its cue materially from the surrounding civic quarter. We were trying to reinforce that part of the city centre, and recognise that facade, which did face south, in the main had to deal with the potential of solar gain. And therefore our facades in the main are quite solid. However, recognizing this kind of specialness that we wanted to create at the top, the solidity dissolves to open up, as I've said, to these amazing views. And in fact, the views are great throughout the majority of the floor plates, and maximizing, importantly, the amount of daylight that can penetrate into the floor plate. The public realm when we first came to look at the site was not great, to be honest. You can see here on the left-hand side the photograph of the existing Odeon cinema with its big blue canopy, and then beyond us Elizabeth House. And there was lots of clutter, and the pavements were not overly generous. And not much sort of activity of any great quality was happening at the ground floor. And it was obviously going to be the front door to our building, and therefore the character and the grandeur of the entrance to our building was important to us, and that there was transparency into the building. And also it gave us the opportunity to increase the quantum of public realm in front of our building. And then here you can see the image of how we relate to number one, and deliberately forming part of a family of new development, reinforcing, I suppose, the brand of St. Peter's Square and the Civic Quarter. And that kind of grandeur is expressed by this double height entrance space, which internally has a kind of very formal reception space divided into two, the normal kind of logical reception area on the right and seating area on the left in our case, with a connection through to the core in the middle. And there was a sort of memory slightly in the way that we designed the interior, a memory of the kind of cinema curtain, one surrounding the desk and one encapsulating the seating area. Then once through the reception area, the kind of technological framework and infrastructure of our base build becomes apparent. We install the touch-free access control at the ground floor, and linked with that is the intelligent destination control lift arrangement. And then, in fact, within the loos, the taps were themselves sort of touch free, and so all of the chatter that is kind of prevalent at the moment about how office design is changing as a result of COVID. This building had already begun, as many other buildings had already begun to pick up on that. I'm not proposing to read through this, but the specification of this building was good, and the brief from our clients was, that please, that we want to create the best, most excellent office building in the city centre, and we believe that we've done that. Interestingly, that we were designing to a BCO guidance, and I think an interesting topic for debate is how relevant or in fact. Given the potential for change in the way that offices are designed, which I think is a good thing, how relevant that BCO guidance will be in the next period for designers. Our sustainability credentials were very good. We achieved an excellent BREEAM rating, and in fact, very early on, our clients recognised the value of technology being integrated into the base build. We were designing a speculative development and had to make sure that all of the infrastructure really predicted the kind of technologies that future tenants might expect, and as a result of that, scored well in the wired score and achieved a platinum accreditation. Down on the lower floors, the focus is really about back of house, and particularly dealing with transportation. I think our clients recognise that sustainable transport is on the up, and in fact, more recently, the quantum of space that had been allocated for cycle storage has increased, along with locker provision. Back up onto the typical floor here, showing off that the open plan column free space, although we do have a secret sort of column here, but I'm just going to ignore that for a moment. It is ultimately flexible for how occupiers and tenants want to lay out their space. Here shown typically a combination of cellular offices and an open plan space. The photograph from the typical floor here shows what one normally expects from a very good quality office space, raised floor, metal suspended ceilings, intelligent lighting, lots of natural daylight. One of the floors has an external terrace. More about external terraces later, but as you can see, fabulous views, and then the finished article here showing the view from ground level. I was also asked to talk a little bit about future forecasting and trends that we are encountering as we are developing office buildings within this slightly different climate. I have to say that I guess most of the future trends that we were talking about amongst ourselves are still there, and I guess a common theme that I keep hearing is that the pandemic has really accelerated those ideas, and I think that is very true. First up, in terms of future trends, relates to sustainability, and this is very much quite rightly legislation-led, and we don't really have a choice, quite rightly. Our buildings need to be green. Lots of modular construction ideas are coming forward. There's a huge drive for improving the amount of green that one experiences in the urban environment. What is your building made of is a crucial decision very early on to achieve our net. Heading towards our reduction in carbon targets. We're actually working on a CLT office building right now, and clearly there has been some time the requirement for renewables on site. But I think that that idea of providing some PVs on the roof is going to increase, and the location of PVs might now begin to spill into the facade itself. There's also been a huge shift in employers recognizing that their staff are actually quite important. Their mental and physical state needs to be really considered and thought about if we want those employers to work hard and enjoy life in our office space. The quantum of outside office space is going to increase massively. I think that's going to be the most significant, actually, physical change that we see in our office developments moving forward. Not just a token gesture of, or even one shared roof terrace. I think it's going to be every single floor. Every tenant must have the ability to have some outside space. Clearly, when it comes to the fit out, designers will be incorporating greenery and planting. And as we have done at the Landmark, recognizing sustainable transport and the amount of space that now requires will certainly increase. And I think developers should also be considering communal shared spaces. Let's hope that we're not socially distancing forever and ever, but recognizing that office buildings or any buildings at all are an opportunity for sub-communities to be built and established, and spaces for physical and mental well-being will be provided. This point about densities is really interesting. I guess social distancing suggests immediately that there are less people on an office floor than previously considered. We were designing office buildings to occupancies of 1 in 8. Is that going to change? It might do. In which case, the knock-on effect is that less energy will need to be pumped into the air conditioning and lighting of our buildings. What I think is more likely to happen is that the infrastructure and the flexibility of offices is going to come under scrutiny, and I think there's going to be a huge amount of data capture from live data capture from the way that buildings are designed, and that we just simply dial down the amount of energy we use in proportion to the number of people that are using the building. I think that will be a big shift in the way that employers and buildings are used. I think there'll be more emphasis on collaboration space And we can certainly do better in the way that we move around a space than having screens and arrows. And I think it's an interesting challenge for designers of offices in the future. Flexibility has always been an important part of designing the base building. What you're always trying to do is predict what people are actually wanting from the space on the far right hand side, and therefore good base buildings need to understand the requirements of the end users. Although we have to recognize that there is likely to be this shift in people working from home, and the buildings themselves may have to become more flexible in terms of their use. So dare I say that office buildings will likely to become perhaps residential and commercial within the same building, even on alternate floors, and that's an interesting idea that we're looking into. Technology really is going to come to the fore when it comes to developing offices. The amount of fresh air and how fresh air is brought into existing offices is really interesting. Typically, the sealed box doesn't really allow us very easily to open a window. I think openable windows again will become normal, and mixed mode ventilation, which actually reduces sustainability, will become much more evident in the next cycle of office design. There's this interesting idea that some engineers have developed, which is called the acoustic fence. Now that more and more meetings perhaps might be held virtually, and offices can't afford to have the quantum of space that is required for everyone to be able to sit in silence in a small space, and they don't necessarily want to create cubicles. That technology through speaker systems can really, like your noise reducing headphones, create a acoustic fence around you so that you can do your virtual meeting without being interrupted by other people walking past. And I think we have an interesting sort of debate about privacy, which will ensue where we, okay, fair enough, we'll get our temperature checked when we walk through the door, maybe not that tricky to deal with, but when it comes to everyone wearing a badge where your distance is being monitored and you've got cameras watching you the whole time to make sure that you are still socially distancing, that's an interesting conundrum for us designers. So that brings me to the end of our presentation. I hope you found that was interesting. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Thanks so much again for joining us on the main stage. We're going to move straight on to our second panel, which is about the post-COVID workspace design and technology. So we're going to be exploring a lot of the issues that we talked about in the first panel, but going a little bit deeper into what are the design, technology and other features that will really create the office of really the immediate future, I think. So I'd like to welcome to the stage David Topham, Chief Executive of CTP, Danny Madden, Director at SI Seeley, Genevieve Pegg, Publishing Director at Harper North, part of HarperCollins Publishers, Stephanie Cox, Director of E3P, and well, hopefully Murray, if we can have him to join later on in this panel. If our speakers could activate their cameras and mics, please, if they haven't done so already.
Morning.
Hi everyone, morning.
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 Hi. Morning. Okay, David, I'd like to start with you first, if that's okay. Can you talk us through some of the schemes that you're developing at the moment and how you're addressing some of these current market trends in terms of the design, function and culture of your workspace?
Okay. I thought this morning's session was really quite illuminating, and it draws into focus, I think, the immediate versus the long term, and how we're going to deal with issues in the short term and the return back to work versus what is the workplace of tomorrow going to be. Obviously, some of those themes were picked up before in terms of the detail of that, and I think it also goes into to what degree COVID is going to overshadow life and business, and to what extent. Clearly, the impact of COVID is changing working practices and accelerating changes which were well underway already. So I think in terms of buildings and schemes that we're looking at, I think there's another theme which is not necessarily for this forum, but about leading cities versus the rest, because one of the key themes that is coming out of the response to COVID and changing working practices is specification, flight to quality, and that flight to quality is a combination of investors seeking out quality, which is about, will be about best buildings, best tenants, best locations, and from tenants' perspective, looking for the best working environments, and whether that's wellness certification, I'll come back to that, enhanced M&E provisions, air filtration, circulation in building, all of this comes with a cost, a massive cost, and whilst and has been touched on, tenants often respond to letting prospects on a cost basis in terms of rent, etc., lease term. For the developer, build cost is a really critical metric, and in the best of locations and viable, sustainable markets, probably can be managed. In lesser markets, it's going to be, I would suggest, quite a substantial challenge. Just touching on the wellness agenda, we've flirted with that wellness certification, and as I think Russell was saying, that the cost of this it can be quite expensive and involved for the team, and the BCO, others could comment on in more detail, but the BCO did a bit of a study on wellness, and their conclusion, I think their last conclusion on this matter, was that there's quite a few standards revolving around at the moment, including the wellness certification, and none of which sort of, from the BCO's point of view, sort of hit the button from what occupiers, investors, developers are really looking for. And we're taking a watch and see approach. And while some developers, including ourselves, are looking at wellness on being wellness enabled, as sometimes we do with wired score, it might be wired score enabled, leave it tenant to sometimes to get certification. I do wonder whether that now needs, from the BCO's point of view, as the leading light in office specification, needs accelerating. They probably are, but I think that needs accelerating. We need a BCO wellness UK-based standard developing probably quite quickly, I think. Okay. So I agreed that specification going forward and the way office space is laid out, I think it's going to be critical. I was reading some time ago, Derwent, London, for instance, are looking at floor to ceiling heights in quite a significant way. Air filtration, zapping, circulating air, and indeed certain locations where an element of natural ventilation, can be conducive. So I think in many ways, it's not that the jury's out. I think this is going to be a journey. We've got immediate responses and thoughts on this, but I think that it's going to take some time to evolve.
Yeah, David, thanks for that overview. I wonder if, just for our members of the audience who aren't so familiar with your specific project, could you just say sort of the one or two schemes that are in your in tray at the moment?
Yeah, okay. Well, most of what we're doing actually at the moment is not under construction, but is on paper, and most of what we're doing actually is in the regional cities. So our focus at the moment, whilst we're looking at a few things in Manchester, we're not nailed on to. Liverpool at Pall Mall is our lead project, which is most advanced. Sheffield, we're looking to bring forward a new office building there, but the market is moving into a pre-let market now. think financing and funding, we touched on investment approaches briefly on the earlier session. And I think investors, their flight to quality in terms of whether you like it or not, secure income is what fires them up. And whilst we all have a thought on valuers' approach to development revolving around income secure, valuing good buildings in good location and valuing the property as well as the income, I think is going to be a key feature going forward. But that requires valuers and investors to move in that direction. So most of what we're doing at the moment is actually in the other regional cities rather than Manchester central focus, but we are actively looking at a couple of propositions in the city at the moment.
Absolutely. Okay, thanks, David. Danny from SI Seeley, as well as office schemes, you've had experience working in the healthcare sector, including on the emergency Nightingale hospitals in Manchester and Preston. I wonder what design and technology considerations from those projects can be applied to office buildings to make them safer, healthier environments while the pandemic persists. David mentioned this WELL certification. Health and well-being was already becoming a more important factor for office occupiers to consider, and developers too. But clearly it's all the more important at the moment for obvious reasons.
Yeah. Hi, good morning. Yeah, we have been involved in the Nightingale hospitals, but we are also involved in a lot of commercial office accommodation. And what we're thinking as a practice, there's obviously a pause, reflect, let's see what's happening. But there's a lot of lessons that we've learned in the healthcare sector for many years on how we contain viruses, how we contain infection control, how we design spaces to ensure you've got the right air volumes going into the space, the right filtration. So what we're looking at is there's going to be, like you mentioned before, David, about updates to design office guidance. And I think there's going to be a sort of transition with some of that design information from the healthcare sector being brought into the office environment and how we design ventilation strategy, for example, because there is clear facts that ventilation is going to be a way to control contaminants, control airborne pathogens within the space. What I bring this back to, I guess, is any sort of is building confidence in people of how they're going to go back to the office environment. I mean, I manage an office of 40 odd staff, and we have members of in that office who are, scared to death of going back to an office environment. So I don't think we're going to do any sort of knee-jerk reactions, but as an industry, the building services industry has got a major challenge to relook at of how we assess office accommodation, as in ventilation. So, for example, on ventilation strategies, typically it's fresh air per person, so you have 10 litres of air per person. But in healthcare sectors, it's more of an air change rate. So you change the air within a space many times to keep it nice and fresh, clean. So if you do like an assessment against Part F of the building regulations, which will also need to be, again, when we mentioned in the first sort of panel, updates to Part L, I think there'll be updates to Part F for ventilation strategies. A typical office would be 2 to 3 air changes, where healthcare sort of general ward areas, you wouldn't go less than 6 air changes. So these sort of things, I think, would bring on. There's not going to be one rule for all. I think what this does is wakes us all up and say, right, well, let's look at not just comfort conditions, temperature control. The wellness is definitely something that brings in this sort of question of air quality. But air quality was always really assessed, I guess, from outside air coming in. But now we're looking at about people bringing in contaminants into spaces and how we control that, which is obviously a major challenge. These proposals that we will look at, there was a comment in the first panel sort of about well-being versus cost, and these measures that you will be putting in place do come with a cost, but that then becomes a part of your feasibility assessment of empty offices versus an occupied office. You want to bring people back. There's no point providing a fit out or a new build office that was cheaper, but you can't actually bring people back. The confidence isn't there, and how you engage with the users and explain the design parameters of how we've improved and controlled the environment within that space. And that this all has consequences for larger plant space, efficiency, maybe ongoing running costs, all these sort of factors you need to we would need to reassess, and there may be some new benchline targets that we'd have to meet.
Yeah, Danny, just a point on that. Actually, I was listening in on a call some time ago. Actually, it was about 3 months ago, maybe, which is led by Arab, and they've got quite a big team looking at UV, ultraviolet role in offices, and whether in two methodologies really are looking at it being located. This is not new technology, of course, and not new theories.
Yeah.
But its effectiveness, looking at it within the AV system itself, but also quite an innovative way of looking at it, which was blanketing at a high level in an office building with a UV curtain almost above people height and everything, but right at the top, so that any air circulating is virtually cleansed by UV. Early days in terms of looking at, but people are looking at those sort of technologies.
Yeah, and I get what I'm trying to say on the healthcare sector. UV has obviously been in the sort of water treatment sector for a long time now. With UV treatment of air, if, for example, a particulate, I don't want to go too techie, but a particulate of a bacteria can hide behind a dust particle, the UV can't hit it. So it can never be 100% accurate or clean. Where I'm talking about air change rates, dilution, full fresh air, bringing into a space, dilute the space, it reduces contaminants. But then we have to assess of how much energy that's going to cost to heat, because we talked about, there was a mention of natural ventilation in the first sector. Now that is a driver to naturally ventilate buildings, but the challenges that you have with naturally ventilated buildings is comfort conditions. In winter, opening a window, the person sat next to the window doesn't like it. So how we improve and ensure naturally ventilated buildings are comfortable as well. So there's a whole sort of thermal model that you'd have to assess to ensure that you get comfort as well as practical.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some really, really interesting insights from you two who are sort of building the buildings, as it were. It'd be great to now hear from our two occupiers in the room about what they're actually looking for at the moment from their space and how they've been impacted by the pandemic sort of conditions. I mean, as we discussed in the first panel, employers are still very much sort of deliberating over how best to use their workspaces at the moment. And from numerous surveys, it seems that the majority is sort of still using this kind of blended working from home or sort of going in a few days a week type approach. So first of all, Stephanie from Consultancy 3P, your company moved into its new office in Trafford Park just before lockdown. Is the space you leased still appropriate and valuable for the company?
Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, we moved into a large unit in Trafford Park with an attached stores unit, large car parking facility to allow for the fleet vehicles. We obviously set it out when we first entered the office in a not considering COVID and then post-COVID. We've rearranged it, we've made it suit, but the space that we have has meant that we are able to really fill the space, where before when we moved into it, it seemed like a huge space that we'd never fill. We've actually now been able to fill it and ensure that we have a COVID compliant office. We are, for our industry, we need to have that kind of, we need to be in the office, we need to have we need to chat to people, we need to have that communication, we need to see people, we need to be able to problem solve together. It's the way of how we provide, innovative solutions for our clients. It's very, very difficult if everybody's working from home. So our space does definitely work for this situation. With regards to ventilation, it's something that I was kind of nodding along to, because it's getting quite a hot topic in the office as it's getting colder, because I sit by the window, so I like having the window, and it's lovely on a nice warm day. But obviously, as it's getting colder, people by the window are getting more cold, and we're constantly having the kind of trade-off. Do you have the heating on? Do you have the heating on with the window open to provide the ventilation? And it is, I guess, in our office, because it's open plan, but there are separate rooms. You can kind of work with the natural ventilation, but I think it is something that is going to be quite important going forward, definitely, because we've kind of looked down the route of the type of air purifiers, all of that kind of thing. But I'd be interested to hear your view on it, Danny, at some point, with regards to air purifiers, because I presume it uses the same kind of UV technology that you were talking about before. But when we've been thinking about it, it's how do you do the natural ventilation in the winter? Do you have the heater on and the window open and go against all practices that you would normally go for before, sustainability wise? So it's one of those which, it is quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's about trying to sort of juggle these things. Everything that people were sort of trying to practice and preach before the pandemic about becoming increasingly environmentally sustainable is becoming ever more challenging. I'd like to pick up on that point a bit later on, but let's turn to Genevieve from Harper North. Your company also recently took up space in 111 Piccadilly, although I understand that you've sadly yet to start fully occupying it because of the ongoing situation. Being a book publisher, you're in a totally different industry to some other people on this panel, the arts sector. What are you guys seeking from your space right now?
Well, it is interesting, yes, because I feel like, we are here under false pretenses, an occupier who is not occupying at the moment. And that partly links into sort of corporate, national and sort of international policies. But we are hugely keen to get back in physical spaces, and it remains a really key part of our business strategy, really. We are, as Harper North, we're in the vanguard of what I hope is publishing finally diversifying from its historic tendency to be based purely around London. But as such, our move here to Manchester was viewed very much as creating a hub office, not purely for a team of local staff, but for us as staffers across the region and attracting and linking into arts organisations really across the Northwest. So as part of that, the office was a key part of that structure. It also plays to our strong interest in diversity and inclusion and creating that visibility through having a physical space rather than being a sort of disparate team and structure, and sort of marketing our business both to readers, to retailers, to future staffers. And so for us, the office remains really important for us. But because we're not there at the moment, we have focused on thinking about what we want the space to do for us when we are back. As I'm sure most sort of office-based businesses have found, I think our process work has moved hugely smoothly online. The tech has been great. And those kind of agendaed meetings, there's no problem bringing those online. But we've identified 3 key challenges and the main things we miss from our spaces. Those, I'm sure you've picked up on repeatedly, are the creative challenges. For those kind of collaborative, sort of free thinking work, the office space is critical, and Stephanie touched on that when she was talking about that way to find innovation, and you need that sort of physical presence, and it's very hard to replicate that fully and organically online, although of course you can go some way towards that. The other factor that we find we miss from being in an office is that peripheral knowledge share. It's the sense of being aware of things that aren't worthy of a global email, aren't affecting your direct team, but you get that sort of cross-fertilization of ideas. And then the other factor that everyone talks about, of course, is the serendipity factor, that halo effect you get from bumping into someone as you walk in the morning. And it's a different way of sort of replicating that when you meet online. No one wants to mingle in quite the same way. So for us, when we do get back into an office space, it's really important. But like any other business, we're listening to our staff talk about issues. We've talked about circulation, the new sort of low contact way of working. And And because we are that hub office, how do you get people in when people can't? We're not going to have lots of our clients, lots of our staff in walking distance. It's working out how the building interacts with its infrastructure. But certainly for us, our sort of main corporate links into London, Glasgow, New York and Dublin, which are our main sort of sister offices, we see the same questions again and again. People saying, when can we get back in, and how can we use it to best effect? And hopefully that we'll find ways to make that happen sooner rather than later.
Absolutely, thanks, Genevieve. I'd like to ask you another question, actually, which is picking up on some of the things you've said about what your team, what your company is valuing about office space and looking forward to when it can inhabit the space. I think, COVID has sort of obviously ripped up the rule book a little bit, but there are plenty of characteristics of traditional workspace that perhaps remain important. For you guys, you mentioned before this event that location, being in the city centre, close to the main station, particularly as you're trying to create this hub for some of your more disparate regional workers and for kind of regional talent as well, in terms of the writers, the authors that you're publishing. These factors were very important for you, right? And these are things that have been traditionally important for offices in decades gone by.
Yeah, certainly. I think that notion of a banner location remains important. That ability for us, we're competing against lots of other people in the entertainment sector. And when you want to have that FaceTime, when it is appropriate and safe to do so, you want to do so in a way that makes the authors, the agents, and the general sort of influencers that we work with connect really smoothly into our business. That might be contacts over towards Media City, that might be dealing with people moving nationally or internationally, and having that sense of being that ease of contact is something that in our business, in that sort of art sector, is really useful. And I think we've always, as a business, we've kind of diversified our settings. Obviously our customer service settings, they're based in Yorkshire. Our logistics and warehousing, they happen out of Scotland. But to have those client contact and sort of talent attraction hubs, you do need an office that's convenient and comfortable.
Okay, thank you for that, Genevieve. David, I wonder if you'd like to come in on that point about sort of what characteristics of traditional office space are still very important right now.
Yeah, well, I think absolutely touched on them there, but I think the other one perhaps to add to your list would be mentoring and tutoring of staff as well. I think that's many of our general business contacts and occupiers. One of the struggles people are having a bit really is the graduates or trainees or people, how you bring them through when that whole point of being in shared space and shared information helps people understand both corporate culture, understand what other people do, peripheral information. I think you touched on as an expression. I think that's key. That is the function of offices, why they exist, isn't it? It's more than just a space to desk. And whilst desking is going to be the lighter load on office space going forward, it's a place of culture and collaboration, isn't it?
No, I think that's very true. I mean, certainly we've actually had to introduce or chosen to introduce new sort of systems specifically for our junior staff members, those first and second jobbers who, as you say, much harder to kind of intrinsically pick up on the corporate culture, to get that informal apprenticeship. And we've got these online systems to try and keep building them on and bringing them along and giving them that network. But we know it's nowhere near the same as being in that same shared space and that happening organically.
Yeah, and can you imagine, you're right, people whose first, second job, and they're working at home and they haven't got that embrace of an organisation. I really do feel for them, and the sooner this comes to an end, the better. The other areas, which are natural flows from the discussion we've been having, is about densities. We're talking to a major operator at the moment, occupier at the moment, and they had, their sort of immediate response was, do we have to change our desking to reflect this? And if we did, well, we'd need twice the amount of space. Could we afford that? Absolutely not. That isn't the solution. The solution is going to be having space which is healthier to be in, and of course we eventually need to come to a conclusion about how we feel about COVID and you know, it in society and eradicating it, vaccinating against it, and moving on and being then aware of these risks on a long-term basis and planning for them. So densities aren't necessarily going to be the way forward. Noise is another area which was touched on, I think, this morning in terms of disturbance, and that comes out of every office survey that I've seen over the years, actually, certainly as offices went to open plan. You know, that general disturbance is, you know, an issue for people, and more so now is some feedback I'm getting in you know, where people are doing more of this, more calls online, and organisations have probably got quite limited meeting rooms and breakout spaces. So people are doing it more at their desks or having to do then it at their desk, which is then more disturbing to the people around them. So will that have an impact on future office design? You know, small pods or more pods. You know, the different ways of working are definitely going to come into those fit-out considerations. But you know, all of these considerations are going to be important, because this sort of communication is going to be a feature of the future, without a shadow of a doubt, even with you know, the concentration being around the office as a corporate and culture hub.
David, that's quite an important point, actually, with the kind of video communications, because it's something that we notice the same when we're back in the office. But obviously, if you're doing lots of video calls, you don't want to be picking up next door's video call, and you do get background office noise. So it's something that we had to think quickly about and create effectively. We don't have working, so we still have an open plan office, and that's where we work in a COVID secure way. But we've created some like little pods for video communications, fully ventilated, which are they are shared spaces, but they are just a blank space. So with a chair and a table and a communications point, gets fully sanitized after use. But it means, and I'm in one now, and it just means that you can kind of get away from your desk, take your call on your own, no disturbance. And we've got a few of those in the office now, which were actually meant to be kind of little meeting rooms, but they work quite nicely as video call rooms, which, and you know, kind of sound insulated, natural ventilation, etc. So I think that's something really important to note. Definitely something we've definitely come across.
We talked about this in the first panel, actually, about this importance of building in flexibility into the design of office space. And I mean, you're lucky, Stephanie, that, you know, the space that you guys had leased before this whole crisis was adaptable to the purpose you're now using it for. I mean, Danny, do you think that it's how easy do you think it's going to be to repurpose office space in this new world? You know, what are the key considerations that designers and developers?
Yeah. I mean, it can all be done, but it's the cost associated with it. It's a shame the architect Murray is not on the call here now, because the way we are going to lay out offices, I guess, is going to change. I mean, if we're going to live with this virus and how we control it and manage it, in the healthcare sector, segregation is the way to manage it. You know, having individual spaces, you know, partitions, this type of thing. But it's probably how that gets brought into the commercial sector in office layouts, because that then goes against this collaborative working, open plan, natural daylight, that nice spacious feel. So it's that challenge of how you make these two spaces, you know, fight against sort of infection and sort of make a space comfortable. And then also make sure you can actually work within there, and people within that space feel like they're not in little boxes and type of, you know, in one of them sort of old-fashioned call centres. So there's definitely a lot of challenges. I wouldn't say I've got all the answers today, but the working from home and the Teams and the conference call, I think that's going to be something that we need to really consider as like the acoustics within an office. We already look at acoustics for just general discussions, but the acoustics of between members of staff working on Teams, working on Zoom, all that type of thing, how that actually is affected and operate, because I don't think getting up and walking to another space is going to really, the whole point of this sort of remote technical software is to be able to be sat at your desk working on something, then just, you know, share your screen, work with somebody else. It's not to be relocating to different spaces in the office, I don't think. So I think all these things feed back into what do people want. You've got to look at. I mean, there was a comment there by Philip Doyle about it's finally we have recognition that offices are about people, and that's where I sort of build the confidence back. Explain how we're going to create an environment for people that can have Teams meetings and feel safe and have the right acoustics, because people are going to be used to working from home, you know, walking 2 yards to the kitchen, getting out of bed, going into the office. That type of thing is going to be trying to get back to normality. Well, I wouldn't like to use some buzzwords, but I think this is a complete different way of working. This sort of agile working is going to be brought right to the, you know, to the fore, to say you might be working in the office for certain days that you need to have a team around you, but then you'll be working at home or to get on with your dedicated projects. So yeah, that's, I think so. Yeah.
I think I'm just going to say that I think the challenge in respect of what workplace is going to look like in the future, how we're going to use it, and how we make it sensitive to either the current situation or something in the future. You know, the quality of space that we want to deliver for the workspace that we want. I think that is, I believe that's achievable. You know, we have, you know, some great brains and great teams around, and given the challenge, just like F1. You come up with a solution, and we will have those solutions. I'm absolutely confident about that. We'll end up with those solutions. I think the bigger challenge is how we address the metrics of the city centre itself, and of how we get people in and out of the city safely, or that they feel safe, and in infrastructure. And you know, at a time when, you know, when I'm in the office now, I drive. I've been in most days. I'm not today, only because of actually my technology for Remo doesn't work clever at home. So I'm normally in the office, but I drive in at the moment. And, you know, driving in, you know, it's okay at the moment. And, you know, probably the rush hour is going to be something of the past now. But like many cities, Manchester's taken the opportunity to expand cycling capacity, which is absolutely the right thing to do. But it's going to cut the capability of people to travel in by car and have that flexibility if they feel that they need to feel safe. How do we get the infrastructure for the city working well? And that is, I think, what is holding back the big city. It was interesting that Chris didn't actually mention it before, but they've just done a sort of an interesting index. What the title of it was, across the cities, and those cities which are the biggest and the best are trailing in terms of the density of activity going on in the city centres at the moment. So Manchester is, you know, well below obviously where its peak was, but in terms of against the national average, London's down, Manchester's down, places like Liverpool are up. And some of the other regional cities, because they're perhaps arguably, you know, easy to get in and out of, people are more relaxed about it. There'll be a number of factors which influence that, but there has to be a big concentration on how we're going to make infrastructure more sustainable for people, because that is going to hold back the drive to get the cities animated again.
I think that's very true. When we speak to a lot of our customer base and our retailers, they've all been talking a lot about this sort of 15-minute city concept that people talk about, suddenly using their very local high streets rather than going to these, you know, the city centres. And when we look at customers which have done very well, of course, they're ones that have a local base, and that sort of sense of hyper locality will definitely be a factor in this. And I think for some offices, for some industries, that works really well. But yeah, as you say, how do we also make those city centres function and make those hubs valuable and give people confidence is a really key question.
I think also picking up on the point about sort of new commuter flows, new transport infrastructure, it's also about the design and sort of incorporating new modes of transport into office space, isn't it? Into the actual building. Danny, do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, for years now, we've had the sort of offices having to accommodate sort of cycle racks and things like that. But are there any new considerations that are emerging now?
There's a question there. I think it's sort of linked to the same thing. How can tech improve the workplace? I think Murray's presentation was going to actually touch on quite a lot of that. How they've designed buildings that you sort of enter the entrance, you don't have to touch the turnstile. You get to the lift, it monitors you like a pass that's in your pocket. It knows which floor you're going to go to. It logs you in. There's sort of like this non-touch approach to getting in and out of an office. I think they've done that at Landmark in Manchester. So that technology is going to be a massive player, and I think, I mean, even when you're out and about walking across the road, touching the traffic light buttons, people are questioning, should you be doing that? I think mindsets of even my 4-year-old and 8-year-old children are, constantly sort of groomed into them about, shaking hands, and this thing going forward, the technology has got to improve and change how we making a cup of tea for the group of office, how that all these things as technology is going to. We're going to be, like David said, there's a lot of great minds out there. We're all going to be working our way to try and find out all these issues that we come across this sort of touch scenario, work out a technology that can overcome it. And there is systems out there, the lift problem that we talked about, and there's ventilation systems that you can put on lifts where it has HEPA filtration and cycles the ventilation within a lift shaft. So whilst you get in the lift, you sort of the air change rate is improved. So all these things are there. It's just that now we probably need to focus a bit more and bring them to the front as that's part of the sort of well-being versus cost assessment again. These things will come with an extra cost, but they're going to provide confidence with the people that use the buildings.
Sure, you're right. It's not just about the telecoms and the connectivity in terms of tech improving the workplace, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the interconnection of those, a little anecdote here, but it'll be so true going forward. In various buildings we've done in the past, the longest lead has often been sorting out the video conferencing. This is of times of old in meeting rooms. So you're doing a full fit out of the office, and everybody, designers will know this. You've got main meeting rooms, boardrooms, whatever. Video conference being sorted out, blinds, lighting, sound, the whole hokey cokey, all interlinking. And that's the long lead and often takes the longest to sort out, interconnecting technology. And even though the technology exists to do all sorts of things with lifts at the moment, it can still be tricky with your access cards and whatever. So the more technology we put into all of those systems, whilst eminently achievable, also, present ourselves sometimes with opportunities which also fall down. Doesn't mean it can't be overcome, but entering into an era of greater complexity.
Yeah, I think my thoughts on this is the automated process. So people don't actually have to do things physically to make things operate. These things are happening in the background, and they just provide a better space. So what we've found with all the rules and regulations that the government's brought in, that most people follow them, but there's an element of people who just don't follow the rules. So you might put arrows down in offices, stay 2 meters away here, do this, do that. Some people don't follow. I think there's a stat the other day about self-isolation. I think only about 20% of the people who get told to self-isolate actually self-isolate. So I think with the sort of the comms systems, with the tech systems, having that actually just carrying on in the background, doing things that people don't even are aware of, as in the ventilation strategy, the lifts, all these things, then it just reduces the risk before people have to ask a question of what they should do. And
I'd like to address our next audience question, which is might occupiers end up needing to take larger space rather than less space so they can have their full team in with social distancing? This was something that Stephanie picked up on earlier. It also links into our chat earlier about co-working and collaborative workspace, and what's the role for that at the moment, because actually it does seem to sort of it does seem, how much does it fit in with social distancing rules, the sort of sociable collaborative office? We don't want to go back to the sort of cubicle mode, or maybe some do, but I think that's something that people fought to get away from for decades, wasn't it? What are your thoughts then on this sort of this feature?
We absolutely do need that open plan large space, because it's just vital for the social element. And like David said before, we returned to the office driven by our younger people because they were desperate to get back. So it wasn't us that kind of drove it. We were perfectly able to work from home, but they needed that interaction. So we will be the open plan office, and the larger space is something that is quite important for us. However, there is obviously the fact that we can't have that in the city centre. We need to step out, so that's why we're Trafford Park. You don't have the transport connections, although we've got the tram that's just opened up, I believe. But we don't quite have that same city centre connection. But it does mean that we can have that larger space, so we can have the collaborative working environment.
Sure. What about you, Genevieve? I mean, your office will be sort of slightly sharing some space, I believe, with some other subsidiaries of your parent company. Is that going to be possible? What are the considerations that are being taken at the moment?
Well, certainly, yeah. I mean, the sort of primary other industries in our company that we share with the newspapers and the radio stations, it means that there are, the idea of a bubble certainly isn't a viable one in our current office space. But I think in some ways we're in the fortunate position by having quite a small direct creative team, that we can sort of fill that space because we're a small immediate team. And our challenge will come a couple of years probably down the line as we hopefully expand and grow and bring more business functions to the Northwest. Then we'll have to assess obviously the size, and of course the location comes with that. And I think it depends for us how much sort of client facing work we do. I think when we don't need to travel, it's you can choose your locations very differently, but it's being able to welcome people in. So that remains something. It's an agenda point on every meeting when we look about our growth and expansion plans. And obviously there's a lot of question marks rather than ticks and crosses at the moment.
Yeah, sure. I'd like to ask you as well about the environmental agenda, and I'd love to put that to Danny as well from the sort of the sort of technical point of view. But is this something that's still important to occupiers? At the moment there's so many other considerations, so many other things to work out and iron out at the moment in terms of what to offer in your office space. Is your company still interested in having an eco office?
So for us, oh sorry.
No, yep, either. Yep.
For us, obviously creating a COVID safe environment came first, but at the same time as us returning to the office, we've also been going for our ISO 14001. So we've needed to kind of adapt anyway, and ensure that we do have that kind of balance the sustainability along with ensuring that we are COVID safe. So there is an element of, yes, we may need to use some disposable wipes, for example, to ensure that an area is sanitised. However, we'll offset it by ensuring we monitor emissions in the vehicles, and every single thing that we do is ensured that there is an offset, but because it's something that is quite a difficult one, because obviously you want to create an environment which is COVID safe, but it's not always the top sustainable option.
Sure. What about you, Genevieve? What's your company's approach?
I mean, it's interesting because most of our sort of our push for that drive towards sustainability and eco awareness comes more in our working practices. Obviously, in a historically paper-based industry, we've had a lot of work to do on sustainability and offset work. But of course, so many of our working practices now have cut that physical usage, and I think that's certainly. The more systems we've embraced now, especially around our design processes and our checking processes, means that when we do return to office space, hopefully we'll be able to look at storage space in a different way. And I think people are thinking about how you move to desk and creative and human space if we don't have the reams of physical stuff around us, which is, again, something that comes up a lot in our discussion meetings. When we talk about how do we physically move our manuscripts, our proofs, our sort of our pen and ink around, and we know we'll be engaging with those in a different way in the future, although they will never disappear, because we'd be lost without a book in our hands.
Exactly. Agree with that.
This will help. This actually is being seen as something to help people flows around the office, people movement, and help make it safer. That's interesting. David, you sounded like you were about to say something there.
I was just saying, absolutely, without books, where would we be? No, I think environmental standards are going to be standard. I think we're going to be taking them as standard. It's going to be, whilst we are constantly perfecting the environmental credentials of new buildings and of existing buildings, investors and tenants are going to take it as standard. I think they aren't options; they're not options. Investors are increasingly demanding higher specification and environmental credentials. Where Manchester is seeking to get to net zero, others will absolutely follow that agenda, and this is the direction of travel, and it'll be taken as standard in the same way that BREEAM is now a standard. Some form of wellness certification is going to be the new standard going forward, in the same way that improved building regs and whatever. If you're not doing that, you're not going to be on the field. So it's a constant drive for improvement, and there's it's that use of the brains and technology which are constantly enhancing what we do. But as a point of principle, it's a standard we all have to achieve.
Yeah, I was going to sort of add the same thing really, actually, because it's important to the panel, but it's important. We were on a climate emergency, wasn't it? Well, it was the hot topic before COVID. Everybody was discussing this. So I don't think it's changed. We still have a climate emergency. We still have targets to try and aspire to. Manchester, as you said, David, has net zero carbon by 2038, so it's not too far away. And they were the biggest challenges, I guess, for the city centre office accommodation, of how existing buildings and new buildings were going to try to aspire to achieve these targets. This sort of move away from the natural gas type heating systems and moving to more electric air source heat pump, that type of system, and the challenges that will bring to infrastructure in this country regarding the electrical infrastructure isn't set up for it yet. People utilising more electric cars, charging points that will require more electric. So there's a huge amount of work that needs to be developed to achieve these. I mean, Manchester's trying to beat the sort of government's 2050, but 2038, 18 years away, it's to achieve that, there's some serious changes. It's not just put a few PV panels on your roof on an office block. There's some serious game changes needed to be made on how we, I mentioned in the first panel about Part L of the building regulations needs to be updated significantly as soon as possible. So we're not building buildings that can still allow, inefficient services. I mean, there's some, Keele University are currently looking at hydrogen as a replacement for natural gas within their district systems. So game changers such as that, where you can utilise maybe your existing gas boiler plants within these boiler houses within the city centres on an infrastructure that has a reduced carbon emission, or as in a fuel source. I think that's going to be the sort of areas where we really need to be pushing. And with people like Keele, they've already implemented that, and their research will be ongoing. But that that's where we need to be getting to. Obviously, we already we do the fabric first. We are making buildings more efficient so they utilize less energy. When I mentioned about the sort of ventilation strategies being changed, these all feed back into the feasibility study that you will assess. You know, if you have to bring in mechanical ventilation with high air change rates, you know, HEPA filtration possibly, all these sorts of things require more energy to utilize, and it's the cost benefit of actually producing that space conditioned or versus the sort of green credentials. So these things have to be assessed, and what are the target that we need to meet. So like I said, there's not one bespoke solution for every building in the country, because we have the, you know, the out of city type office facilities, the sort of low story where natural ventilation can be managed a bit better. The city centres, you know, to strive towards naturally ventilating those, I've got more challenges with, you know, I think obviously the move towards making them more pedestrian cities, taking cars out of the city centre and having sort of better transport into it, that's going to be a game changer, David, like with the improving cycle lanes, all that type of thing. So sustainability, how important? It's very important, and it's going to be one of them key questions when you do your sort of assessment of a future new build or refurbishment of an existing facility. Out of all the assessments, that I think that will be a key driver.
Sure. Okay. Now, look, we're rapidly approaching the end of our session. We've got about 2 or 3 minutes. If any of members of the audience have any more questions, now's the time. But just to wrap up, something we haven't touched on, and I appreciate it's perhaps sort of not so pertinent for our 2 occupiers in the room, but something we haven't talked about is actually how, you know, in this sort of new world with people working from an increasingly diverse set of locations, you might have to think about putting workspaces into schemes which weren't originally intended to be offices. You know, how about putting workspaces, formal workspaces within residential schemes, etc. Well, we already have seen hotels putting co-working spaces in their lobbies. So just to wrap up, I suppose, David, would you like to finish up on that point? Is that something where you see opportunities for you as a developer?
Well, I think it opens up the discussion about BTR, doesn't it? Build to rent, and really what's that all about, and the facilities and amenities which are going into those new developments, of which, you know, Manchester's at the forefront at the moment. So yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, residential accommodation is going to look to make greater provision for people to work remotely. If you look at the housing trends, 3 and 4 bed houses have been out pitching the market over the COVID period, over the lockdown period, as people, those who want to move, can move, are moving to larger properties so they can have a proper work at home experience or space. And I think BTR type investments, bespoke developments, are carving out quite significant space as amenity space for people to work outside of their apartment, you know, as shared space socially, but also for workspace. And there was a discussion this morning, wasn't there, about you know, maybe cities having spokes of office space in you know, I forgot what the expression is, but, you know, which is easy to walk to. And one can imagine, certainly in Manchester, you know, the likes of Stockport's, Altrincham, and other centres, Sale, Stretford maybe, where people, you know, big residential conurbations, they could jump on the metro when they want to and get into the centre, but maybe there's a touchdown type of work share space happening. How you finance that, how you fund that, what the model for that is, you know, you can envisage it. I think might be a bit tricky, but I'm sure the likes of Brunt are on that 100%. So, but that's going to happen, isn't it? More choice, I think, you know, seems to be a feature of our times in everything we do. More choice is what we need to offer everybody, and I think demand will drive new and innovative approaches, I think, both in the home and you know, more remotely. So you're not stuck in the house all day, but you can pop down, you know, to the market, something like that. And there's space where you can have a proper call. And and joining something like this without, say, having to go into town or doing it at home where there can be either distractions or just because for your personal well-being, being in a different place when one's working as opposed to home, you know, we like that work-life balance, don't we? Of environments as well as physically what we're engaged
Absolutely. In. Really, really important points, David. And there's so much food for thought here. And I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. So we're going to have to wrap up. But it's been a great conversation, both in this panel and the one before. And we hope we really have gone some way towards addressing a lot of the confusion and unanswered questions and uncertainty in the industry at the moment. And, you know, it seems that by and large, all of the different players across the different sectors of the property industry are sort of aligned in terms of their goals. So thank you so much to our speakers for their comments and views, and also to our audience for your engagement and questions. I hope the event has been very useful and interesting for everyone watching. So thank you again to our sponsors, DAC Beechcroft, SIC Lee and ROC Consulting. If you enjoyed the networking and you want to give it another go, we have a further half an hour now, so you can stay around and chat to guests, share thoughts on today's subject and arrange follow-up meetings in the other room. Our next Place Northwest event will be the Industrial and Logistics Update on 16th of October. You can register for this via our website. Thanks so much again for coming today, and we hope to see you all very soon.